I have been reading a little bit. I feel like monthly wrap-ups just don't work for me anymore, so I thought that instead I would do some random wrap-ups, I guess. These are 5 random books that have nothing to do with each other. You know, I've read some other books, but I feel like reserving those for different videos where I can do some more thematic wrap-ups. Is this annoying anybody? Okay, so where do we start? Who do we start with? Okay, let's start with Miss A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki, honey. This is my favorite book of all time. If you didn't know, it's one of my... Something's leaking.
Cindy! The TV's leaking!
Right, okay, so A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki is literary fiction. It is set between West Coast Canada and Japan. We're following a woman named Ruth who is essentially a fictionalized version of Ruth Ozeki herself. She finds a diary on the coast of the island off of BC that she lives on. The diary is in a Hello Kitty lunchbox. She opens it, she realizes that it's from a young Japanese girl named Naoko Yasutani who wrote the diary as kind of like a lengthy suicide letter, essentially. So we're reading the story of this woman, Ruth, who's reading the diary of this young girl, but we're also reading the diary along with her, so it's kind of like a dual perspective. One of my biggest struggles as a booktuber is reviewing this book. I have just never been able to review this book, and I don't know how to do that because it is just one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life. It's a reread for me. Obviously, it's my favorite book of all time. I read it back in 2016, and since then I've been trying to articulate my feelings about this book and why I love it so much, and I just can't do that. And I think it just has to do with how layered and how what's it what? Crickets. That's all I'm hearing, literally and otherwise. Multifaceted. Bitch, I'm a grad student. It's very philosophical and there's a lot of surrealism in it as well. It's meant to be a very philosophical and psychological exploration of the relationship between a reader and a writer, and those sort of surrealistic, fabulous elements are kind of added in there to further explore that. It's honestly something that you have to experience on your own. If you haven't read this book, please read it. If you have read it, I know you loved it. If you didn't love it, jump off a cliff. I'm just kidding, don't jump off a cliff. At least not a steep one. Speaking of cliffs, okay. The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. Right. Okay, hello. Loved this. This is a sort of whimsical, fairy tale-ish. Not really fairy tale-ish, but like whimsical, doesn't take itself too seriously, light-hearted fantasy, which is my kind of vibe. That's the fantasy that I tend to prefer. So it's about this guy named Linus Baker. He has a stick up his ass, and not in a good way. He is basically sent by the government who he works for on this assignment to spend a month at this orphanage to make sure that that everything is in good shape, because this orphanage houses 6 of the most dangerous children with magical abilities. But as he spends the month and he gets to know the children, he realizes that nothing is wrong with them. They're just regular children, and they're sort of being stigmatized because of their magical abilities by the wider non-magical society. So the book ends up being somewhat of an allegory for discrimination and treating people different based on their differences and all that kind of jazz. It's a peak white liberalism, but I'll let it pass because it's so good. It's so fun, it's so wholesome, beautifully written, and there's a queer romance at the heart of the book that just absolutely touches me. Speaking of peak white liberalism, there's a little bit of controversy surrounding this book because of the fact that the author decided to allegorize real life experiences of like indigenous Canadians and Mexican immigrants at the US-Mexico border to sort of inform the underlying, I guess, politics and themes of this story itself. I heard about all this controversy after I read it, of course. So my first reaction was to be a little bit defensive because I was just like, well, authors do this all the time, like they take, real life experiences and traumas and they allegorize it in their fantasy stories and in their fictional stories, and that's true. And I don't necessarily think that TJ Klune did anything like irrevocably harmful. However, I had to kind of like take a step back and put myself in the shoes of people who were upset, right? Particularly indigenous Canadians. If a white author or an author who's just not from the Caribbean in general decides to use, for example, Indian indentureship in the Caribbean to inform something in their light-hearted, happy-go-lucky fantasy, I might have issues with that. I mightn't like say, cancel the book, and nobody's advocating for this book to be cancelled or anything like that. But I do think that there's a discussion to be had about the way that, whose right it is to take other people's traumas and histories and allegorize it in their stories. And I will link some articles and some things in the description down below that you could read, where you could get a wide array of different perspectives on this whole discussion. Another popular book that everybody loves, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I didn't meant to hit it that hard. Okay, it's fine. So essentially, The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo is about a Hollywood actress, a fictional Hollywood actress, of course, an old Hollywood starlet who rose to fame in the 1950s, Evelyn Hugo. She's being interviewed by this young journalist named Monique, who is writing Evelyn's biography. And so we're reading the story of this journalist who's interviewing this famous Hollywood starlet, but we jump back into Evelyn's past as she tells her story, and we go back to the 1950s when she first broke into Hollywood and became famous, and we're looking at her life as a famous person navigating being in a queer relationship. It's called The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo because she's most infamous for being married 7 times. But what a lot of people don't know was that the greatest and biggest and truest love of her life was not any of her 7 husbands, but rather a woman by the name of Celia St. James, who was another famous actress. So the book is essentially about how, it's not really a story about fame, but it's about how fame impacted her relationship with Celia, because she loved Celia and Celia loved her and they wanted to be together. But they had to navigate, being under the public eye as these huge famous public figures and being in a queer relationship at a time where that obviously was not widely accepted. I made a whole video talking about this book, by the way, so just go watch that if you want to know more of my thoughts on it. But essentially the main focus of that video was kind of the discussion surrounding how people never really mentioned that this was a queer book. Like, they would read it and say like, Evelyn Hugo is about this famous woman who was married seven times and she's been interviewed by a journalist. People barely, or they like scoot over the fact that Evelyn is bisexual and that she was in a relationship with a woman, and it's never really mentioned a lot when people talk about this book. And I had a lot to say about that, as I do about everything. Next up we have Displacement by Kiku Hughes. This is a graphic novel. I don't usually read graphic novels. I don't do this often. This is a graphic novel about this girl named Kiku, who, given that she has the same name as the author, I presume that a lot of her life is based off of the author's own life. Kiku is half Japanese, half white, and she doesn't really know too much about her Japanese heritage because she wasn't super close with her Japanese grandmother. And I believe this book is kind of inspired by Kindred by Octavia E. Butler, because one day Kiku is sent back to the past, to World War II, where she is in a internment camp where the Japanese Americans were being put during that time. So she keeps getting sent back in time, and she's referring to these episodes as displacements, which is why the book is called Displacement. So a lot of the book is about her just sort of being in the camp and interacting with other people and living there for a really long time and wondering whether she'll be sent back to her appropriate time period. It's really good, and there's definitely a lot of interesting things about this book, and I would say one of the main takeaways is that it's a story about how important it is to know your history and how sometimes unreliable our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents could be, because a lot of the times people from marginalized communities or marginalized histories or who come from oppressed communities, they were taught to sort of repress that and not talk about it. And Kiku's grandmother never really told Kiku's mother a lot about what happened when she was at the internment camp. The displacements were essentially kind of like a force that wanted to force Kiku to confront this history that she's never really learned to appreciate before. So it's a really interesting story, the way that it's told, and the way that the way that the author tries to highlight the importance of knowing your history and where you come from, historically speaking. The last book that I want to talk about is Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs? Big Questions from Tiny Mortals by Caitlin Doty. So Will My Cat Eat My Eyeballs is essentially a compilation of questions that Caitlin Doty, a mortician, has gotten from children over the years about death. So this book really kind of like makes the reader understand that death is, I'm going to use the word again, it's multifaceted, because death is biological, right? Your body, you die, you decompose, all that kind of stuff. But it's also social, it's economic, there's a lot of like laws involved in certain things. It's also philosophical, it's an emotional thing. It's something that, informs a lot of art, right? Death is just a very multifaceted, interdisciplinary phenomenon, right? I didn't love this book as much as I loved her two previous books, just because those books are more along the lines of memoirs, so they're a lot more personal and reflective and introspective, and I appreciate that a lot more. Whereas this is just straight trivia, but it's still very enjoyable, and I still learned a lot from it. In fact, I actually came across a lot of things that I already knew, because as an astute deathling, okay, I was quite familiar with some of the things that Caitlin Doty was talking about, because I had seen her talk about it in her previous videos and her previous books as well. So it was really cool to kind of like be like, oh yeah, I know how decomposition works, Caitlin. So yeah, I felt like a little bit nerdy when I was reading this, and I enjoy that. I felt like, you know, a death connoisseur. So that's it for some of the books that I've read recently. I'll try to do more wrap-ups as I read more books if that happens. In the comments down below, I'd love to know if you've read any of these books, if you have any thoughts on them. That being said, thank you all ever so much for watching this video. I hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.